This is People and Their Poems, a podcast about the poems that make a difference in our world. In each episode, writer and educator Sandy Carlson talks with a person who has been influenced by poetry and become a poet or a supporter of this literary form. Stay tuned.
There is no water near, but something draws him here. It could be moths or flies, yet looking in his eyes, I think that Hopper knows. As our queen's belly grows, a princess will appear. Could that keep Hopper here? I just can't shake the thought, the swagger in his hop, the something that I saw. My future son-in-law.
Welcome to People and Their Poems podcast. I'm your host, Sandy Carlson, and I'm here today with Chris Gaffney of Wolcott, Connecticut. He is a stay-at-home dad who has a 2-year-old son and a 4-year-old daughter. Before that, Chris was deeply involved in politics, law, public policy, and stand-up comedy. He has a writing degree from Ithaca and a JD from UConn, and he is an award-winning humor writer. He's got a manuscript out there called Baby Bump, and you can find out more about Chris on his website, uncommondiscourse.com. Welcome, Chris, and thank you for joining us at People and Their Poems.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
I'm excited for a really interesting conversation because you've got quite a diverse resume there and a wide range of interests, and I can't wait to see how that shows up in your writing.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It's, when I was looking for jobs throughout my life before I became a stay-at-home dad, I would always get to an interview and people would just be holding my resume and look so perplexed. And they would say, how does this all fit together? And luckily I was able to weave it all into a narrative that makes sense.
And a unique human being. And you know, I was a stay-at-home mom, and I tell you what, I wouldn't trade those years for anything in the world. So I just want to say I completely respect your choices, and I'm sure it's quite an adventure for you.
Oh, it absolutely is. It's something I'm very passionate about.
Well, I think it's amazing. For our listeners, would you describe yourself as a poet, though? Tell us more about that.
Yeah, my entry into poetry is relatively recent. I do consider myself more of a humorist traditionally, although it's an ever-evolving landscape for me. I've always been interested in writing. I kind of grew up as a kid just reading all the time. I would take my mom's old electric typewriter, and I would type out copies of my Berenstain Bears book so that I could tell everyone that I had written a book. And so I've been just really interested in the process of writing throughout my whole life. And in my younger years, I was, really trying to be a little bit more pragmatic about that. I was very interested in becoming a speechwriter. The dream was to be a speechwriter at the White House someday. And so I got very involved in politics, kind of working my way up towards that, and a series of life events took place that had me really come back to Connecticut, where I was rooted. My mom lived alone and had pancreatic cancer, so I became her caregiver for the last several years of her life, and got involved locally in Connecticut politics, worked in the state legislature, and did some great stuff with that, along with getting a law degree, and then did a complete 180 when my girlfriend at the time, now my wife, Jenny, worked for a company that was acquired by another company in Austin, Texas, and moved down there for a few years. At the time, we thought it might be forever, and just basically did a reset on my life and went from law and politics to comedy and marketing, and got involved. Digital marketing was sort of in its infancy down there, and got into a marketing agency and ended up finding that my talents translated really well into that arena. And then I would go out multiple times a week performing stand-up comedy. They had a very vibrant scene down there. So I went from, in kind of November of 2010, I ran for state representative in my hometown, and I go and talk about these really important issues with, senior citizens and voters who tended to only to be senior citizens in Avon. And then by February of 2011, I was in comedy clubs talking to 20-year-olds about, relationships and stuff like that. So it's really just been an interesting way to transfer my skill sets.
Well, I tell you, Chris, if I were holding your resume, what I would see is somebody who's very flexible and sees language as a tool for navigating whatever circumstances life throws your way. And can you take us from the comedy to the poetry?
So just on the point you mentioned first, I was very nervous when I told my dad that I was going to be a writing major. He worked in insurance for many years, and he was very practical. And when I told him, he actually thought it was a wonderful idea, because he told me that he hired hundreds of people throughout his career, and he always gave a leg up to English majors or history majors or journalism majors, because it meant that they were probably pretty good writers, and that writing is such a versatile skill that you can really use it anywhere. And so for me, I would write out my stand-up comedy down in Austin because I really just enjoyed it. It was a social scene. You moved down there without knowing anybody, and I could get together with these really creative people and sort of write about the things I was going through in a way that was fun and make each other laugh and, make people laugh. And then when I came to Connecticut, we moved back. There's really no comedy scene here, certainly not to the extent.
No way, no comedy in Connecticut?
Yeah, not to the extent of Austin, at least. And so I got very involved with storytelling and Toastmasters groups. I did a number of their speech contests. I actually advanced all the way to the quarterfinals of the international speech contest one year. I got second place in the quarterfinals, and still regret that. But the guy who beat me was very good. It was a deserving loss. So I got involved with that, and as I started doing that, I just realized that there are so many versatile elements to the way that I could communicate with people, and I would go where the audience was and go with the things that felt right to me. And a lot of the things I was writing about were not so humorous. They were things, dealing with my mother's passing, things dealing with some of the harder issues that I had been grappling with at that time. And then as sort of darkness, like a cloud, passes over and things light up, my wife finally, after years of trying, became pregnant. And it was the 15th week of pregnancy when I first picked up a poetry book. And the reason for that is that the 15th week of pregnancy is when the fetus can first hear voices outside the womb. And we had gone out to dinner and we had sort of been talking. It coincided with the anniversary of our first date. So we were talking about our relationship and everything, and said, wouldn't it be cool if our daughter's first sounds were us talking about kind of the history of our love? And we went home that night, and she was, feeling pregnant and got comfortable in bed. And I took out a book of classic children's poetry to read to her womb. And I opened it up and started reading, and very quickly realized most classic children's poetry is about murder. And so I'm reading, Peter stuffing his wife in a pumpkin shell, and all these sort of odd poems that had that dark sensibility from the ages in which they were written. And the rhythms just kind of got into my head. And the next morning, I was driving to work, and a poem kind of like a jolt popped into my head. After that, I took that home and I read that to my wife that night. We got to work and wrote it down, went home, read it to my wife, and it made her laugh. And that when your wife is pregnant, you kind of feel helpless. There's not that much you can do. It wasn't the easiest pregnancy. We found out morning sickness is terribly misnamed. It goes all day long. And she was kind of in the middle of that still, even though people had assured her it would pass by that point. And so making her laugh felt good. It felt good for her, it felt good for the baby. And out of that, I started writing poems sort of about the experience of being an expecting parent, really with no aim other than making her feel seen and making her feel loved and making her laugh. Eventually, some close friends and family members became pregnant with their own children, and I started sharing the book with them. So I don't have anything in a final copy yet, but I print out anytime someone close to me is pregnant, this little book just at Staples. It costs about $11. And I took some images and stuff, and I give it to them at their baby showers. And sometimes I'll even write a poem kind of dedicated to them. And it's been really, really well received in that regards. And then I took that concept with me this fall to the Irma Bombeck Writers Workshop, which is the largest gathering of humor writers. It happens every 2 years in Dayton, Ohio, which is where Irma Bombeck went to school, and she has a foundation out there that honors her memory. And I was able to show it around a little bit there, and I got a lot of really positive encouragement. And so now I'm kind of diving into the Connecticut poetry scene and trying to learn a little bit more so that I can round this out and make it a viable product that I think will help a lot of people at a point that is really a vulnerable but impactful time.
That's amazing. You said some things that really resonate with other poets that I've spoken to on this podcast, and that is an appreciative audience. Whether it's people remembering when they wrote for their teacher when they were little, or their family, that human connection seems to be a vital thread that runs through everybody's story about why they write. And having been a pregnant woman once upon a time, I never thought of my husband at the time as helpless. So that's a very helpful image, because you are the beach dwell laying there and nobody can row you back out to sea.
Sure.
The time will come when it will come. But that's really, really interesting. You alluded to some of the children's poetry that's about murder, and that made me laugh. Some off the top of your head that people might not be aware of readily, but will come to mind as soon as you say them? I know we have Peter Pumpkin Eater.
I don't off the top of my head, because I kind of stopped reading those at that point. The ones I read to my children now, we read all day long, and I love children's literature, but we're reading, more modern things like Llama Llama, Red Pajama, and, all these things that I think, like I bring that up because I consider that like a benchmark of great poetry. And a lot of people might be hesitant to say, a children's book would be a benchmark of great poetry, but I'd put it up against any sort of revered poem. If you watch even a child who doesn't understand language yet, when you read that book to them, the pacing of it, the rhythm of the words, it translates that feeling of apprehension of being alone, which is like the scariest thing to a kid, right? They have attachment issues. And then it brings in the soothing and the comfort. And even though my daughter or my son wouldn't know the words at that point, I could see them physically reacting to the emotions of the language. And that's kind of what I strive for a lot in my writing as well.
I'm thinking of Peter Pumpkin Eater had a wife but couldn't keep her, so he put her in a pumpkin shell, and there he kept her very well. I don't think childhood lasts long enough for anybody to unpack that. There's the sing-songiness of that, but there is also the underlying, what's that about, that we get. And I'm actually even thinking of Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky, which is about, it's nonsense. The words aren't words. but you're slaying something and coming back with its head in your hand.
Yeah.
You know. So there's always that going on, and that wasn't so long ago. The 19th century, it wasn't such a harsh time that we needed to go running around with our enemies' heads in hand, you know, much less teach that to children. Chris, would you mind reading some of your poetry for us so we can get a sense of your voice?
Sure. All right. So the one that I'm going to read today, it's called You Started as a Secret. And this was actually published in the Connecticut Bard's Poetry Review last year as well. And the reason that I chose it is that I think it gets most to the emotion of sort of that first moment of us becoming parents, or becoming expecting parents, at least. As I mentioned, it took Jenny and I several years to actually conceive our first child, and so we didn't want to get carried away with our enthusiasm. And this poem is an attempt to authentically relate the essence of that experience. You started as a secret. You started as a secret. We couldn't wait to tell. First to learn was Grandma. She heard and nearly fell. Next came both our families, so happy they all cried, ecstatic for this blessing, 'cause they knew how long we tried. Finally, we told everyone our secret was unchained. In our life without the whispers, the joy was unrestrained. A cascading shower of affection rained down from above. Our tiny little secret begot a world of love.
That's nice. As you were reading, I was just imagining being the child for whom that was written and reading it in years to come. You know, that's a lovely poem, and it's a lovely, lovely legacy to your child, your children.
Yes, and that's really one of the main things that's motivating me here. I've been doing this now, coming up on 5 years this summer, because my daughter is 4, and we started when, she was pregnant. I didn't originally have any intent of trying to publish this. As I've shared it more and more and seen the response, I'm kind of tightening it up, and I actually may incorporate a few stories with it and try and put out a actual book. But like this copy is something I gave to my wife one year for Christmas, and she keeps it in our nursery, and my kids will ask me to read these poems to them from time to time. And there's one that my wife took, and it's one of her favorites, and she paid an artist on Etsy to kind of make an illustration, and she framed it, and this hangs in my daughter's nursery in her bedroom. And I can read that to you if you'd like as well. This is called Hopper, and you see the picture of the little frog with a crown. It's kind of very beautifully done. It's the only copy that exists. It's just a gift. I'd be happy to share that with you if you'd like. This is my wife's favorite poem that I've ever written.
Yes, please. That would be a great treat. Thank you.
Based on an entirely true story, by the way. It's Hopper. Little tiny Hopper, the toad beneath my throne, gallant, noble Hopper, who always hops alone, ribbiting his greeting almost every evening, just as I'm getting home. There is no water near, but something draws in here. It could be moths or flies, yet looking in his eyes, I think that Hopper knows. As our queen's belly grows, a princess will appear. Could that keep Hopper here? I just can't shake the thought, the swagger in his hop, the something that I saw. My future son-in-law.
Oh, that's great.
So that was written because every day, as I was coming home from work around that time of year, there was this little frog who was just in between our garage and our home. It was an unattached garage. And as soon as I would open one door, he would scurry under the stairs of the other door. And we were perplexed as to why this frog was sitting around our house all the time. We had no ponds or anything at that time. We now live across from a reservoir, but at that time we lived in Wallingford across from high voltage power lines. So I don't know what was going on there.
Oh, that is a great poem, and I just love your use of language, imagery, the rhyme and the meter that are such a beautiful introduction to children of the power of language to invite a celebration and a love of life and a love of family. So thank you, Chris, for sharing this with us on People and Their Poems. And I hope you have a publisher soon. I think we need your book.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, and there's also a bit of an advocacy component to it as well. I'm very active with the National At-Home Dad Network and a few fathering groups. I actually host a monthly dinner for Connecticut stay-at-home dads, kind of a bit of a support group type thing, a bit of a camaraderie type thing. And you can learn about that at ctdads.com. But the hope with something like this is when we get it into the hands of expecting parents, that it will encourage fathers to get involved at that earliest possible moment, as I did, which is that 15th week of pregnancy, and to sort of just have that moment between spouses or whatever their relationship might be, between partners who are going through this journey together. And I do try very hard in some of the current drafts that I have to be inclusive as well. And there are some poems that could relate to people who come about having children in all sorts of different ways, who may not have done it the gestational way that my wife and I did, because I want it to be something that can really help translate to some of those issues that people are experiencing in not just pregnancy, but the early infancy and earliest years as well. There are some imaginative poems about babies and toddlers in there as well. So that's the hope with this project, at least, is to be a little more inclusive than just the experience that my wife and I had.
Well, that's terrific. And I think however human beings come to the amazing experience of being parents, the power of language to help build those relationships remains the same. And that is the common thread that runs through your resume, your life, your poetry. And thank you for weaving that into our story too, Chris.
Oh, absolutely. It's a pleasure. I really appreciate your having me on. I've listened to many, many episodes, and I've enjoyed all of them. And it'll be a thrill to see my name up there at some point in the near future as well.
Yeah, it'll be our honor, Chris. Thanks a bunch.
This has been People and Their Poems, a podcast about the poems that make a difference in our world. Be sure to check the show notes for any special links relating to this episode. If you want to learn more about the podcast, visit peopleandtheirpoems.net. Or if you want to learn more about Sandy and her work, visit sandycarlson.net. Thanks for listening.